Put the mop down, old man. You're embarrassing yourself in front of my cadets. I wasn't trying to embarrass anybody, sir. I only said the map was wrong. The map? You're correcting the map. What would you know about war? You clean the toilets. More than you'd want me to say in front of these young people, sir. Say it then. Go on. Right here. Say one true thing about war. Some men earn their medals, and some men just wear 'em. They called him the quiet one, 69 years old, gray in his beard, a push broom worn smooth by his own two hands every morning at 4. Same green work shirt, same soft, mornin' to a hallway with nobody in it. For 11 years he mopped the floors of Belhaven Military Institute, and in 11 years, not one person there asked him his name. They stepped over his wet floors. They let the door swing back in his face. They saw the uniform he wore, and never once wondered about the one he used to, because folded in a cedar box, under a church program and a lock of a dead woman's hair, were 3 medals of honor. 3, from one man, a number the history books almost don't allow. And on a cold Tuesday in October, a captain who had never heard a shot fired in anger looked that old Janitor dead in the eye and asked him what he knew about war. What happened next emptied a parade ground, silenced a general, and made 200 cadets stand at attention in the rain. But to understand that, we have to go all the way back. Ivy Bend was the kind of town you could drive through with your eyes half closed. One gas station, one church, one traffic light that blinked yellow all night like it was too tired to pick a color. Elijah Monroe was born in the back bedroom of that 2-room house in the summer of 1955, and the first sound he ever heard, his mother liked to say, was the sound of his father's hands, big hands, rough as fence wire. His father, Amos Monroe, worked the loading dock at the lumber mill 6 days a week and preached at the little clapboard church on the 7th, and Elijah grew up believing those 2 jobs were the same job. Carry what's heavy, Amos would tell him. That's all a man does, son. He finds what's heavy, and he carries it, and he doesn't complain about the weight. Elijah was 7 the first time he understood what his father meant. It was a Sunday, hot, the kind of heat that made the pews sweat. A boy from the next county over had come to church with a brand new pair of shoes, white leather, laces still stiff, and he stood in the yard afterward, showing them off to anybody who'd look. Elijah looked down at his own shoes. Cardboard cut to fit inside where the soles had worn through. His mother had done it that morning at the kitchen table, carefully, like it mattered, and told him nobody would ever know. The boy from the next county knew. "You got paper in your shoes," he said, loud, so the other children turned. "Look, he got paper in his shoes," and Elijah felt his face go hot and his hands curl, and something rise up in his chest that wanted to swing. But his father's hand landed on his shoulder, just landed there, heavy, steady. "Look at me, Eli." Elijah looked up. "A man's worth ain't on his feet," Amos said, quiet so only his son could hear. "It's in what he carries. You hear me? Let 'em laugh. Laughin' men never carry nothin'." Elijah didn't understand it that day. Not fully, but he tucked it away, the way you tuck away a seed, and he didn't know yet how deep it would grow. His mother, Della, was the softer of the 2, but don't mistake soft for weak. Della Monroe could stretch a chicken across 4 days and make each night feel like a feast. She could sew a torn collar so clean you'd swear it never tore, and every single night, no matter how tired, she came to the edge of Elijah's bed, put her hand on his forehead like she was checking for a fever that wasn't there, and said the same words. "You are not what they say you are. You are what God says you are, and God don't make junk." Elijah heard that sentence 10,000 times. He would carry it a very long way. There were good years in that 2-room house. Poor years, but good ones. Summer nights on the porch, his father humming low while the crickets went on and on. Winter mornings when the wood stove ticked and popped and his mother pressed a warm biscuit into his cold hands before school. The smell of Sunday, starch and hair grease, and his father's one good suit, worn thin at the elbows, pressed sharp anyway. Elijah learned to work before he learned much else. By 10, he was hauling water. By 12, he was splitting wood, the axe near as tall as he was. By 14, he was strong enough that the men at the mill would slip him a half-day's pay to help unload a truck, and he'd bring every coin home and set it on the kitchen table, and his mother would look at it a long moment before she touched it. "You don't have to do this, baby," she said once. "Daddy says a man finds what's heavy and carries it," Elijah said. "I'm just starting early." His father died the winter Elijah turned 16, a cough that wouldn't leave. It took him fast, the way it took a lot of men who worked their whole lives breathing sawdust. And at the end, in the back bedroom where Elijah had been born, Amos Monroe reached up with one of those big rough hands and held his son's face. "You're gonna carry a lot, Eli," he whispered. "More than most. I've seen it in you since you was small. Just promise me one thing. Don't let the weight make you hard. A hard man drops what he's carrying. A soft man never does. You be soft, son. Be soft and be strong. Ain't nobody ever tells you that's the same thing, but it is." Those were the last real words his father said. To him, Elijah would spend the rest of his life proving they were true. School came hard and left early. There wasn't money for more than the necessary years, and by the time Elijah was 17, he was working the same loading dock his father worked, stacking lumber until his shoulders sang. He might have stayed there his whole life. A lot of good men did, but the war came for Ivy Bend the way it came for 1,000 small towns, quietly, in the mail. A thin envelope, a date, a bus. Elijah was 19 when he shipped out. He had never been more than 40 miles from the two-room house. He had never seen the ocean. He had never held anything more dangerous than a hunting rifle his uncle let him borrow. The war was nothing like the recruiter's poster. It was mud. It was heat that sat on your chest like a wet dog. It was waiting, and then everything happening at once, and too fast to understand. Boys from Ohio, and boys from Georgia, and boys from towns even smaller than Ivy Bend. All of them 19, all of them scared, all of them pretending not to be. And Elijah Monroe, it turned out, had one gift that mattered more than any other out there. He did not run the wrong way. When the world came apart, when the noise came and the other men froze or scattered, something in Elijah went quiet and clear, the way it had gone quiet the day the boy laughed at his shoes, his father's hand on his shoulder. "Look at me, Eli." And Eli would look at what was in front of him, and it was almost always the same thing, somebody who couldn't get up. The first time was a ridge with a fictional number. The maps just called Hill 704. His unit got caught in the open, and a machine gun opened up from the tree line, and men went down, and the rest of them pressed themselves flat into the dirt and could not move, would not move, because moving meant dying. And a sergeant named Whitfield was out there, hit, screaming, 30 yards up the slope with the gun, chewing the ground around him. Nobody moved. Elijah moved. He didn't have died too. He'd tell you that himself, 50 years later. There wasn't a decision. There was just Whitfield screaming, and a body that already knew what it was going to do. Eli crawled up that slope through the dirt and the noise, got a fistful of Whitfield's collar, and dragged him back down inch by inch, using his own body as the cover. And he did not stop until they were both behind the rocks. Then he went back up, because there was another man. And then another. By the time it was over, Private Elijah Monroe had pulled 4 men off that hill. That was the first medal. He was 19 years old, and he'd been in the country 6 weeks. The Kesson Valley came a year later. The river, the burning bridge, the 19 crossings. And there was a third action after that, on a night so bad Eli never spoke of it at all, not even to Ruth. That made him a legend in circles. He would spend the rest of his life avoiding 3 actions, 3 medals, 1 man. And here is the thing you have to understand about Elijah Monroe. He did not come home a hero. He came home as a ghost. He came home in the winter, on a bus that dropped him at the blinking yellow light, and he walked the last 2 miles to the 2-room house in his uniform. And when his mother opened the door, she didn't scream and she didn't cry. She just looked at him, really looked at him. The way you look at somebody who's been somewhere you can't follow. "You carried something heavy over there," she said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am. You gonna tell me?" Elijah looked past her, into the little house, at the table where she'd cut cardboard for his shoes. "No, ma'am," he said. "I don't believe I am." And Della Monroe, God bless her, never asked again. There was a box the Army sent along later. Elijah put it up in the closet, on the high shelf, behind the winter quilts, and he did not open it in front of anybody, and for a while he did not open it at all. Because the men he'd carried home in his memory did not care about medals, and the men he couldn't carry home, the ones still in the Keeson Valley, the ones whose faces came at night. A medal was an insult to them, a shiny lie, a thing that said this was worth it, and Elijah Monroe would go to his grave not believing that any of it was worth it. So he did what his father taught him. He found what was heavy, and he carried it. And he did not complain about the weight. He met Ruth at a church supper the spring after he came home. She was passing out cornbread, and she dropped a whole tray of it. And while everyone else laughed, Elijah got down on the floor and picked up every piece, quietly, and stacked it back on the tray. Ruth watched him do it. "You know that cornbread's ruined," she said. "The floor's clean," Elijah said. "Your mama mopped it this morning. I watched her." Ruth laughed, a real laugh, from the belly. And Elijah Monroe, who had not laughed in over a year, felt something in his chest come unlocked. They married that fall. Ruth was the only person on this earth who ever saw inside the box. It happened 3 years into their marriage. A thunderstorm. Elijah upright in bed, gone somewhere, his hands moving like he was still carrying somebody. And Ruth held him until he came back, and in the gray light of morning he got up, went to the closet, took down the box, and set it in her lap. He didn't say anything. Ruth opened it, and Ruth, who was never at a loss for words, was at a loss for words. "Beely," she whispered. "No," he said, "and they ain't gonna, but this is, Eli, this is Ruth." He took her hands, both of them. "Those aren't mine, you understand? They belong to men who ain't here to hold 'em. I'm keeping 'em safe, that's all. I'm the keeper, not the hero. You promise me. You promise me you won't tell a soul." And Ruth looked at her husband. This quiet, gentle man who picked cornbread up off clean floors and cried in his sleep for boys buried on the other side of the world. And she made the promise. She kept it for 41 years. They never had children. It was a grief they carried between them, and they carried it the way Elijah carried everything. Quietly, without complaint, they filled the house with a garden instead. Tomatoes, collards, a stubborn fig tree that Ruth swore would never fruit and that fruited every August out of pure spite. Elijah worked. First the mill, then, when the mill closed, whatever there was, he fixed things. He hauled things. He never made much, and he never owed anybody. And every Sunday he sat in the third pew from the back of that clapboard church and mouthed the words to hymns in a low, cracked voice. And every night, before bed, Ruth put her hand on his forehead, the way his mother used to, and said the words his mother used to say. "You are what God says you are, and God don't make junk." Ruth died in the spring. Cancer, fast and cruel. Elijah held her hand until it went cold, and then he sat with her for a long time in the quiet, and then he stood up, straightened the blanket, and went out to water the collards, because they were thirsty, and it wasn't their fault. He was 62 years old. and alone for the first time in his life. The house got too quiet. The garden got too big. The pension didn't stretch the way two pensions had. So when a cousin told him about a job 3 counties over, a big fancy military academy up on the ridge, always hiring for the cleaning crew, decent pay, quiet work, Elijah packed the cedar box, the church program, and the lock of Ruth's hair, and he moved into a rented room in the town of Ashford Hollow. And that is how Elijah Monroe, holder of 3 Medals of Honor, came to be the man who mopped the floors at Belhaven Military Institute. He arrived on a Monday. And this is what invisible looks like. Day 1. A young officer let a heavy door swing shut in Eli's face while he had both hands full. Didn't look back. Didn't know he'd done it. Day 2. A cluster of cadets walked straight across his freshly mopped floor, tracking mud in a long brown streak, laughing about something, and never saw the man leaning on the mop against the wall. Day 3. Someone spilled coffee in the stairwell and left it because leaving it was somebody else's job, and the somebody else was Eli. Day 4. A cadet asked him where the dean's office was, said, "Hey, you guy," and when Eli told him, walked off without a thank you. Day 5. Nobody spoke to him at all. Not one word, not one, day after day after day. 11 years of days, and in all those years, all those thousands of mornings, only a handful of people at Belhaven Military Institute ever looked Elijah Monroe in the eye and asked him a single thing about himself. He didn't mind. That's the part they'd never understand. He didn't want to be seen. A man who's crossed a burning river 19 times does not need a stranger in a hallway to tell him he matters. He knew what he'd carried. He knew what God said he was, so he mopped, and he stayed invisible. And it suited him fine. He was assigned the West Wing. Classrooms, the lecture hall, the long marble corridor they called the Hall of Honor, glass cases full of swords and flags and photographs of grim-faced men, plaques listing graduates who'd gone off to be generals and heroes. Elijah mopped that hall every morning at 4 a.m., alone in the dark, and the funny thing, the thing he never told anybody, is that sometimes he'd stop in front of the glass cases, lean on his mop, and read the names. He knew some of those names. He'd carried 2 of them out of the Keeson Valley on his back. But he never said a word. He just cleaned the glass and moved on and kept his secret in a cedar box on a high shelf in a rented room. Safe, the way a keeper keeps a thing. He found one kindness at Belhaven, a first-year cadet named Josiah Bell. Josiah was 17, skinny as a fence post, from a town even smaller than Ivy Bend, and he was drowning. Homesick, behind in his classes, last in every drill. The other cadets had money and confidence and fathers who'd worn the uniform, and Josiah had none of that. And it showed. Elijah found him one night in the empty lecture hall at 2 in the morning, sitting alone in the dark, shoulders shaking. Most men would have backed out quietly. Elijah pulled up a chair. "Long way from home?" he asked. Josiah wiped his face fast. "I'm fine, sir. Sorry. I'll clear out. I didn't ask if you were fine. I asked if you were far from home." Elijah sat. "'Cause I know that look. Wore it myself once." And something about the old man, the calm of him, the way he didn't seem to want anything, made Josiah start talking about the failing grades, about the cadets who laughed at his accent, about the letter he'd almost mailed home that said, "I quit. Come get me." Elijah listened to all of it. Then he was quiet for a while. "Can I tell you what my daddy told me?" he finally said. "A man's worth ain't on his feet. It's in what he carries. You still carryin', son. You're just carryin' it in a hard place. That ain't quittin'. That's the heavy part. Everybody wants to carry when it's light. You carry when it's heavy. That's when you find out who you are." Josiah looked at the old janitor for a long moment. "What's your name, sir?" he asked. "Nobody ever told me your name," smiled. A small, tired, kind smile. "Monroe," he said, "but you can call me Eli." From that night on, they were friends. Josiah brought Eli coffee some mornings. Eli helped Josiah study terrain maps at 2 a.m. when the halls were empty, and Josiah noticed, sometimes, that the old man seemed to know an awful lot about terrain, about high ground and low ground, about how a valley could kill you. But he figured everybody's granddaddy knew a little something, and he let it go. Josiah's grades came up. His head came up. By October, he was no longer in drill, and it was in October, in the Hall of Honor, in front of 24 cadets, including Josiah Bell, that Captain Nolan Price decided to make an example of the old man with the mop. Now stop for 1 second. Imagine you were Elijah. You've carried the heaviest thing a man can carry, and you've carried it in silence for 50 years. Nobody knows. Nobody thanks you. And now a man half your age, who's never bled for anything, is about to humiliate you in front of a room full of children. You could tell them. One sentence ends it. Or you could swallow it, like you've swallowed everything. Would you speak? Or stay quiet? Think about that. Hold on to your answer, because Eli made his choice, and it wasn't the one you'd expect. Captain Nolan Price was 34 years old, and everything about him was sharp, sharp jaw, sharp creases in his uniform, a voice that could cut a cadet in half from across a parade ground. He taught tactics and modern doctrine, and he was good at it, good at the words of it, the diagrams, the theory. His office wall held 4 framed certificates and a photograph of himself shaking hands with a senator. What Captain Price's wall did not hold was a single decoration for valor. Because Captain Price had never been to war, he'd spent his whole career on bases and in offices and at conferences, and somewhere along the way, he'd decided that saying things loudly about combat was the same as having seen it. He did not like being corrected by anyone, and he especially did not like the old janitor. It had started small. It always does. The first week, Price had stepped over Eli's wet floor with the yellow caution sign right there and slipped, just slightly, and instead of thanking the man who'd warned him, he'd snapped, "Can't you do this at night? People work here." Eli did it at night. Price just never noticed the nights. The second week, Price found Eli looking at the big framed campaign maps in the corridor, the ones from famous battles, and said, in front of 2 other officers, "Careful, the tour's on the 3rd floor. Wouldn't want you to get lost with the grown-ups." The other officers laughed. Eli said nothing. He wiped the frame's glass clean because it was dusty and moved on. The 3rd week, Price made a habit of calling him, "Hey, Sport." Not his name, never his name. "Hey, Sport, there's gum under the desk in room 12. Hey, Sport, somebody's going to trip on that cord." He said it the way you'd talk to a dog you didn't particularly like. And, every time, Elijah Monroe answered the same way. Polite. Low. "Yes, sir, I'll see to it, sir." Because his father taught him something, a long time ago in a churchyard, with a boy laughing about paper in his shoes. Let 'em laugh. Laughin' men never carry nothin'. So he let Price laugh. He had let a lot of men laugh over a lot of years, but something was building. You could feel it. The way you can feel weather coming before you see a single cloud, because the old janitor made him uneasy in a way he couldn't name. The way Eli moved, slow, economical, never a wasted motion. The way Eli looked at the tactical maps on the wall was a beat too long. The way once, when a cadet asked a question about holding a position under fire, Price had seen the old man in the back of the room go very still, and his eyes go somewhere far away, and it had bothered Price all afternoon. Like the janitor knew something he didn't. So, on that cold Tuesday in October, when Price brought his tactics class into the Hall of Honor to study a large terrain map of a historic mountain campaign, and Elijah Monroe happened to be there, quietly mopping the marble floor, the captain saw a chance to put the old man in his place once and for all. "Cadets, observe," Price said, tapping the map. "This ridge here, this is the decisive terrain. Whoever holds this high ground holds the battle. The defenders held it, therefore the defenders won. Simple. Elegant, this is doctrine. The cadets nodded and scribbled. And Elijah Monroe, quietly, without looking up from his mop, said one word. No. The room went still. Price turned slowly. I'm sorry? Ellie kept mopping. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. It had just come up out of him, the way truth does when you've earned it too hard to hold it down. Beg your pardon, sir, Eli said quiet. It ain't my place. Go on. But Price had heard it, and the cadets had heard it, and a captain like Nolan Price could not let that stand. No, no, please. Price spread his hands, and his voice went silky. Dangerous. You said no, to me, in front of my class, so let's hear it. Enlighten us. What's wrong with my map, janitor? Ellie straightened up slowly. He looked at the map, and for a moment, just a moment, the 50 years fell away, and he wasn't in a marble hall, he was in a valley, in the rain, with the map in his head instead of on a wall. That ridge, Eli said quietly, pointing with a hand that had gone still and certain. You can't hold it. Not really. You see how it drops off behind, into that draw? Man holds that high ground, he thinks he's safe. But he's got no way down. No cover for a fallback. Enemies don't come to the front. He comes up through the draw at night, and he takes the low ground behind you. And now your high ground's a trap. You're surrounded on the very hill you thought was winning you the fight. Eli lowered his hand. Whoever wrote that book wasn't there, sir. High ground ain't about how tall it is. It's about whether you can live on it. The cadets were silent. A couple of them, the sharp ones, were looking at the map now with new eyes, seeing the draw, seeing the trap, and that, the fact that his own cadets were listening to a man with a mop, was what made Captain Nolan Price lose his composure. That's enough. His voice cracked across the hall like a whip. Do you have any idea how many years I studied to teach this? Do you have a degree? A commission? Any credential at all? No. You have a bucket. You have a mop. You clean the floor I walk on. He stepped closer, looming over the old man. So let me ask you something, and I want the whole class to hear the answer. What would you know about war? And Elijah Monroe looked up at him, slow, calm, 50 years of silence in his eyes. More than you'd want me to say in front of these young people. Sir, say it then. Price was almost shouting now. Go on, right here. Say one true thing about war. The hall held its breath. Josiah Bell, standing near the back, felt his own heart pounding, wanting to step forward, not knowing how, and Eli, quiet, unbroken, a man who had picked cornbread off clean floors and carried the dead across a river, gave the captain the only answer he had left. Some men earn their medals, he said softly, and some men just wear 'em. The silence after that was total. Price's face went white, then red. He knew. Everyone in that room knew exactly which kind of man Eli had just called him, in front of his own cadets. Get out, Price said, low and shaking. Take your mop and your bucket, and get out of my hall. And if I see you correcting my instruction again, I'll have you fired. You'll be scrubbing gas station bathrooms by Friday. Do you understand me, old man? Do you understand who you're talking to? Ellie looked at him a long moment. Then he bent down, picked up his bucket, gathered his mop, and, without another word, walked out of the Hall of Honor, past the glass case comes of full of Norman's head he'd carried on his back, past the cadets who wouldn't meet his eyes. He walked out with his dignity, because it was the one thing that had never been for sale. But something else walked out of that hall too, because Josiah Bell had seen the old man's eyes when he talked about that ridge, had heard the certainty in his voice, had spent 2 months watching Eli, read terrain maps at 2 in the morning like he was reading his own hand. And Josiah Bell did not believe, not for 1 second, that Elijah Monroe was just a janitor. So that night, Josiah did something. He started asking questions. It started with a photograph. Josiah couldn't stop thinking about the way Eli had described that ridge, the draw, the trap. Whoever wrote that book wasn't there. Those weren't the words of a man who read about war. They were the words of a man who'd survived one. So Josiah went to the one place at Belhaven that kept the old records. The basement archive, a dusty room the cadets called the crypt, run by a soft-spoken old librarian named Mr. Adler, who'd been there longer than anyone could remember. "I'm looking for a valley," Josiah told him. "Overseas," called the caisson. "There was a bad fight there. 50, maybe 55 years ago." Mr. Adler's eyebrows went up. "The Kesson Valley, son. That's not a battle. That's a legend. Worst 3 days of that whole war. Why on earth would a first-year cadet be asking about the Kesson?" "Because," Josiah said carefully, "I think somebody who was there is mopping our floors." Mr. Adler looked at him for a long moment. Then he stood, went to a locked cabinet, and pulled out a heavy-bound volume, a unit history, its pages yellow and soft. "There was one man," he said slowly, turning pages. "The stories about the Kesson all come back to one man, a private. They called him the ferryman, because when the bridge got blown and the river came up and the wounded were stranded on the wrong side under fire, this one soldier crossed that river, again, and again, and again, in the dark, under fire, carrying men on his back. They say he made the crossing 19 times in one night. 19. Nobody's ever confirmed the real number because half the men he saved were unconscious when he carried them." Josiah's mouth had gone dry. "Does it say his name?" Mr. Adler ran his finger down the yellowed page. "Stopped. Monroe," he read. "Private Elijah Monroe." The whole room seemed to tilt. "That's not all," Mr. Adler said, quieter now, turning more pages, his own hands starting to shake. "Son, this man, he didn't just get one medal. The Kesson was the second time. There was a valley before that, and there was a hill after. 3 separate actions, 3 separate citations." He looked up, and his old eyes were wet. "3 medals of honor, son. There are only a handful of men in the entire history of this country who ever received more than one, and you're telling me one of them is here?" "He mops the West Wing," Josiah whispered, "every morning at 4. Now, here is where it turns, because there was one other person at Belhaven Military Institute who knew the name Elijah Monroe, the commandant. General Adeline Cross. General Cross was 66 years old, the first woman to command Belhaven, and a soldier to the bone. And what almost nobody knew, what she never spoke of, was that General Adeline Cross had begun her own life 50 years earlier as a terrified young combat medic on the wrong side of a flooded river in a valley called the Kesson. She had been one of the wounded. She had been carried out of that valley on the back of a man whose face she never clearly saw in the dark and the rain. A man who set her down gently on the far bank said, "You're all right now, you're all right," and went back into the water for the next one before she could even ask his name. She had spent 50 years wondering who he was. She remembered so little, and she remembered all of it. The cold of the water, the way the current pulled at her broken leg, like it wanted to keep her. The impossible strength of the arms that lifted her, a stranger's arms, and the chest she was pressed against, that was somehow steady in all that chaos, a heartbeat going slow, and even when the whole world was screaming, she remembered the bank. Being set down on the mud, gentle as you'd set down a sleeping child, and a voice, low and warm, close to her ear. "You're all right now. You hear me? You're all right." And then the arms were gone. He was already wading back in. She'd tried to call after him, tried to ask his name, to say thank you, to say anything, but the words wouldn't come, and the dark swallowed him, and by the time the medics reached her, the man was just a story people were starting to tell. She had gone on to have a whole life, a career, a command, a wall of her own honors. She had stood over the graves of soldiers and told their mothers they did not die for nothing. And every single time, some quiet part of Adeline Cross had thought, and I only got to do any of it because a man I never thanked went back into the water. She had spent 50 years searching, quietly, through every record she could find, and every record was sealed, redacted, or lost, and every trail went cold, and she had made her peace, mostly with the idea that she would never know the name of the man who gave her the rest of her life. So when Josiah Bell, brave, terrified, 17 years old, knocked on the commandant's door the next morning with a yellowed unit history in his hands and said, "General, ma'am, I think I know who's been cleaning our floors, and I think you need to see this." General Adeline Cross took one look at the name on that page, and she stood up so fast her chair fell over. "Where is he?" she said. Her voice was shaking. "Where is he right now?" "West Wing, ma'am. It's 4:15. He'll be mopping the Hall of Honor." And General Cross, a two-star general, the commandant of the entire institute, ran. She ran down the corridor in the gray dawn light, past startled cadets, her boots hammering the marble, and she burst into the Hall of Honor. And there he was, an old man, gray beard, green work shirt, leaning on a mop in the dark, alone, in front of a glass case full of other men's names. He looked up, startled. "Ma'am? Is everything all right? Something spill?" General Cross stopped 10 feet from him. She couldn't speak. She stared at his face, and 50 years fell away. And even though she'd never clearly seen it, some part of her knew. "The Keeson Valley," she said, and her voice broke on it. "The river. 19 crossings. You set me down on the bank and you said, 'You're all right now,' and you went back in the water." Elijah Monroe went very, very still. The mop slipped from his hands and clattered on the floor. "You were the medic," he whispered. "The little one. Broke your leg coming off the ridge. I told you to stop kicking or I'd drop you." And General Adeline Cross, commandant of Belhaven Military Institute, a soldier of 40 years, put her hand over her mouth and began to cry. "You never told anyone," she said, 50 years. "You saved. Eli, you saved dozens of men. You have 3 medals of honor. Why would you? Why are you here? Why are you carrying a mop?" And Elijah Monroe bent down slowly and picked his mop back up. Because that was what he did. He picked things up. "Ma'am," he said gently, "somebody's got to keep the floor clean." The word spread through Belhaven faster than any word had ever spread. By noon, everyone knew. Everyone. And Captain Nolan Price, who had, 48 hours earlier, stood in that exact hall and sneered, "What would you know about war?" Captain Price heard it in the officers' mess, and the fork froze halfway to his mouth, and every drop of blood drained out of his sharp, handsome face, because he understood, in that moment, exactly what he had done. He had looked at a man who crossed a burning river 19 times to save the wounded, a man who held 3 of the highest honors his country could give, and he had told him he cleaned the floor. Price walked on. He had said some men just wear their medals, and the old man had looked him in the eye and said some men earn them. Captain Price set down his fork. He was not hungry anymore. He would not be hungry for a long time. The reckoning came fast, and it came in front of everyone. General Cross convened the entire institute, every cadet, every instructor, every officer on the main parade ground 3 days later. 200 cadets in formation. A cold October drizzle is coming down, and she told them the story. She told them about the Keeson Valley, about the flooded river and the blown bridge and the wounded stranded under fire, about the private they called the ferryman, about 19 crossings in the dark. She told them. She knew the story was true because she had been on that man's back, a terrified girl with a broken leg, and he had set her down on the bank and gone back into the water for the next one. And then she said a name, Private Note Elijah Monroe, and she turned and she gestured. And Elijah Monroe, in his green work shirt, because he owned no other good clothes, walked slowly out to the center of the parade ground, and he did not know what to do with his hands. "This man," General Cross said, her voice ringing across the wet formation, has worked in this building for 11 years. He has cleaned your classrooms. He has mopped your halls. He has picked up after you. And not one of us, not one, ever thought to ask who he was. She let that land. He holds 3 medals of honor. There are fewer men who have done what he has done than there are fingers on my hands, and he told no one. Because he did not do it for medals. He did it because there were men in the water, and he could carry them, and so he did. Her voice dropped. That is what a soldier is. Not the uniform, not the rank, not the words we say in a classroom. That. And then General Adeline Cross, Commandant of Belhaven Military Institute, faced the old janitor, and she saluted him. A 2-star general, saluting a man in a work shirt, and behind her, 200 cadets as one, snapped to attention and saluted too, in the rain. Every hand up, every eye forward, and nobody moved. The rain came down soft and steady. It ran off the brims of 200 caps. It soaked through the old man's green work shirt. And still nobody moved, because nobody would break that salute until the general did. And the general was not breaking it, and so they held it. A whole institute, frozen, honoring one man, Elijah Monroe, stood in the center of that parade ground. And for one long moment he was not there at all. He was in a valley, in the rain, 50 years gone. He could see their faces, the men he'd carried and the men he couldn't. Sergeant Whitfield off that first hill, the medic with the broken leg who wouldn't stop kicking, the ones who made it, the ones who didn't, all of them. He carried them still. He'd carried them every single day, through the mill and the marriage and the garden and the grief and 11 years of mopping floors in the dark, and he had never once set them down, and he had never once complained about the weight. He looked at all those young people standing in the rain for him, and something in his chest, something he'd held shut for half a century, finally, quietly, came open. His eyes filled up, and he did the only thing he could think to do. He straightened his back, and he saluted them back. Somewhere in that formation, a skinny first-year cadet named Josiah Bell was crying so hard he could barely hold his hand up. But he held it. He held it the whole time. Now, what about Captain Nolan Price? Price was not dragged out. He was not screamed at. Justice, the real kind, is quieter and heavier than that. General Cross had him report to her office the morning after the parade, and she did not raise her voice. "You told a Medal of Honor recipient that he cleans the floor you walk on," she said. "You mocked his service in front of cadets you are charged with shaping. And here is the part that ends your career at this institution, Captain. It was never about whether you knew his record. You didn't mock him because he lacked medals. You mocked him because he held a mop. You looked at a man doing humble work, and you decided he was beneath you. That is the exact opposite of everything we are supposed to teach here." Price's discipline was formal, and it was public. He was relieved of his teaching post. A board reviewed his conduct. The senator in the photograph on his wall did not return his calls. Within the year, Nolan Price was quietly gone from Belhaven, his name spoken only as a lesson. The officer who sneered at the ferryman. But here is the part the old man would have wanted you to hear. Before Price left, Elijah Monroe asked to see him. Everyone expected the old man to want an apology, to finally get his own back. Instead, Eli sat across from the disgraced captain, and he said this: "I ain't here to gloat, son. I'm too old for it. I just want to tell you one thing my daddy told me. A man's worth ain't on his feet, it's in what he carries. You got a lot of years left. You can spend 'em carrying that shame, or you can put it down and pick up something better. That's up to you. But I'd hate to see a young man waste a whole life, proving he's better than a floor." He stood. "The floor never hurt anybody. Be good, Captain." And he left. That was Elijah Monroe. He did not just hold 3 medals. He held grace for the man who spat on him. As for Eli, the town did not let him go back to a rented room and a push broom. The story went beyond Belhaven. A reporter came, then more. And the country, for a little while, remembered a name it never should have forgotten. Belhaven Military Institute established the Monroe Scholarship, a full ride, every year, for a cadet from a small town with more heart than money. The first recipient, by unanimous vote of the faculty, was a skinny second year named Josiah Bell. The Hall of Honor got a new glass case, the largest one, right in the center where every cadet passes it every day. Inside it sits a cedar box, a church program, a lock of a woman's hair, and 3 medals of honor, and a photograph of an old man in a green work shirt, leaning on a mop, smiling that small, tired, kind smile. The plaque beneath it reads, "He carried what was heavy." He never complained about the weight, and the Institute bought the old man a house, a real one, not a rented room, a small white house at the edge of Ashford Hollow, with a yard big enough for a garden. Elijah Monroe planted tomatoes, collards, and a stubborn fig tree that everybody said would never fruit up on that ridge. It fruited the very next August. Out of pure spite, he liked to say Josiah Bell came by most Sundays. They'd sit on the porch and shell peas and not talk much, because they didn't need to. And every night, before bed, Elijah Monroe stood at his window and looked up at the ridge where the young cadet slept, and he put his own weathered hand on his own forehead, the way his mother used to, the way Ruth used to. "You are what God says you are," he'd whisper into the dark, "and God don't make junk." Then the old ferryman would go to bed, and for the first time in 50 years, he slept through the night. So, let me ask you something. How many people have you walked past today? The man emptying the trash, the woman mopping the hallway, the quiet one nobody thinks to ask for a name. What are they carrying that you'll never see? Elijah Monroe crossed a burning river 19 times and told no one. He carried 3 of the highest honors this country can give in a cedar box on a closet shelf. And a man in a fancy uniform looked at him and saw a mop. Don't be that man. If this story moved you, if it made you want to look a little closer at the quiet ones, then do 3 things for me right now. Drop a comment and tell me, who is the person in your life that everybody underestimates? I read every single one. Share this video with somebody who needs to remember that worth isn't in the uniform, it's in what you carry. And subscribe and turn on that notification bell, so the next story like this one finds its way to you. Because the loudest men in the room are almost never the strongest. The strongest one is usually the one holding the mop.